This Late Night Linux Family podcast is made possible by our patrons. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can join them. Support us on Patreon for access to ad-free episodes and early releases. That's latenightlinux.com/support. 2.5 Admins, episode 290. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, your customary Clara article plug, Alan, is ZFS fast dedupe for Proxmox 9.
Yeah, so wrapping up our mini-series on Proxmox, we talk about how to configure and when it's useful to use ZFS's new fast dedupe with Proxmox 9, now that Proxmox ships with a new enough version of ZFS to have access to these new features.
Right, well, link in the show notes as usual. Microsoft has decided that if you're using their Authenticator app on a rooted Android phone or a jailbroken iPhone, they're going to delete your Entra credentials.
Yeah, this is some serious bullshit. I mean, it boils down to Microsoft saying, you have to be using a sanctioned device to connect to Entra. And it feels like we're on some kind of a slippery slope that leads to Microsoft saying everyone must own an Xbox and use it for everything they do in computing. I'm not a fan.
I don't think it's quite that extreme, but it kind of ties in with what Google's doing with this forcing developers to be registered with them and, trusted and all the rest of it.
You say it's not that extreme, and I strongly disagree. This is the same shit Microsoft has been pushing since literally the late 90s with the Palladium initiative. It started out on the Xbox side where they were absolutely desperate to lock it down to keep people from being able to, hack into the console by using save games. A lot of the time was the way that used to be done. You would find a game that didn't do proper input validation on saved games, and then you would modify a save game maliciously. You'd smash the stack and you get access to the console. Microsoft absolutely hated that. And again, beginning with the Palladium initiative, they have been trying to lock down all devices to only be in a company-approved configuration, regardless of what the users want, for literal decades. This is not new. It's the same shit. The only thing that is new about it is now they're demanding that you not even jailbreak devices that not only do they not even provide, they're not even running Microsoft's operating system. That's a lot, man.
I could see this being a useful option for admins to impose on their users. It would be fine if Microsoft said, hey, we've given you this option.
I agree with you completely. I would not complain for one freaking millisecond about an option in your Azure configs that said disallow access from jailbroken or rooted devices. Okay, sure. Put that checkbox in there. Hell, maybe even if it's on by default, maybe that's okay too. If your user that's running, the Graphene OS or whatever has to come to you and say, hey, I got this, message that I can't connect with, my phone that's running a different distro, and you then had the option to deal with it, honestly, I'd be okay with that too. I think that's a little extreme given how frequently people wind up needing to jailbreak devices these days just to kind of get through the day the way they want to do it. But just saying, no, you don't get to get on Entra, nah, I don't like that. It's not okay.
Interesting take from the register here of maybe that means that your employer has to buy you a phone if they're going to make you use their MFA if you can't use your rooted phone. You have to have an employer-supplied device to do anything for the employer. They don't get to free write off you having a phone anymore because of this policy.
Which also blows, man. I mean, have you ever had to carry around two phones, one personal and, one work phone? That is nonsense. And, I'm a big old dude with big old dude pockets. And I'm like, no, I want no part of that. That sucks. And then what happens if you got more than one job, man?
Yep. You have to have a Batman utility belt full of phones.
You love that, Alan. You love having the old phone on the belt, don't you?
Only one phone, though.
Well, this kind of leads on to your less than stellar experience with Microsoft regarding MFA recently, Jim.
Yeah, to be fair, it's not just Microsoft. Microsoft and Google alike are terrible about their break-fix workflow regarding MFA that hasn't been enabled. I first actually encountered it with Google because, Google didn't initially require MFA for any accounts on Google Workspaces. And I have one client who has had Google Workspaces for a very long time, back when it was, I think before it was even G Suite, if you remember that ridiculousness. At any rate, they had this existing account, had been in play for years and years. And when Google pushed their policy to require MFA after 6 months, they just disabled all the accounts including the administrator account on that domain. So when I go to try to fix it, every single FAQ and every single, click support here, they all said the same thing, which was log into the panel with your admin account and disable MFA and then re-enable it. Well, how do I do that, genius, when I can't log into the admin account because it requires MFA that was never enabled in the first place? This is not the kind of thing that it should have required, some kind of rocket surgeon to figure out was broken, but didn't stop Google. And Google, I don't know if they're still doing it, but I mean, for months they had, people in their support forums telling people exactly this stuff again. And the only way around it was to, actually open a support ticket with Google to disable MFA. And it's getting really hard to directly open tickets with companies either. Fast forward to Microsoft. Much more recently, I acquired a new client. And the whole reason I acquired this client is because this is a not quite retired yet architect who dropped his phone. And when he dropped his phone, it broke. So no more MFA. He was still able to get to his Outlook on his PC because, the PC doesn't actually require the MFA. It only requires it when you set up the account on the device, not every time you log into it. So far, so good. But again, the problem is he no longer had his phone. So he went and bought a new phone, tried to install Outlook on it, and discovered he couldn't get the account added because, again, it wanted him to MFA the account on his old phone that he doesn't have. And he is the admin for the domain. He first tried to hire somebody else who just went through hours and hours of looking up all the Microsoft resources, which again, just keep saying, oh, well, you just disable MFA and then you can re-enable MFA, which you can't do because you can't log in. And when you point that out to the Microsoft MVP requires, oh, well, you call support. Well, what happens when you call support? You cannot get to a human when you call technical support. You get a phone tree, and there is no way through that phone tree that gets you directly to a human. What you get are canned responses to various problems, and anything revolving MFA, well, I'm pretty sure you know what the robot is going to tell you to do. The only way to open a ticket is to call Microsoft's account receivables department. You can get to a human there. The robot still answers the phone, but if you cuss at it and tell it you want a human, you're going to get a human because that's the department that takes money. The saddest part about all this is that poor accounts receivable person that you get is in absolutely no way confused or surprised when you tell them, I'm sorry, I actually just called because I want to open a support ticket. They know exactly what you're doing, why you're doing it, and they have that tool right there at their fingertips. I suspect at this point, that's probably the majority of what a lot of the billing reps are doing every day. Now, this is already incredibly frustrating, but what happens after you get hold of somebody who can actually open a support ticket, you do not get connected to support. You get put in a callback queue, and typically between about 1 and 3 business days later, you'll get a call at some random time from somebody who works most likely at Convergys, which is one of the subcontractors Microsoft uses for their tech support. So you are still not even actually talking to Microsoft. The Convergys rep will call you back at whatever time they choose, and hopefully you'll be somewhere that you can deal with it. And hopefully then at that point, you can get across to them, they just need to disable the MFA temporarily so you can log in. Most of the time, at this point, once you've got that ticket in, and once your 1 to 3 business days have gone by and you actually get that call back, you're usually good to go at that point. But in this case, not so much. I'm assuming Convergys rep, she does not seem anywhere near clued enough in to be honestly working in the IT industry at all, let alone directly from Microsoft. It has now been well over 2 full weeks since I got the first call back from my Convergys rep, and she claimed that, quote, the back-end team, unquote, who she has to open tickets with to actually do anything, because again, she doesn't work for Microsoft. She keeps claiming that they disabled MFA. They didn't. Once per day, she calls either me or the end user who has told her repeatedly, don't call me, call my consultant, who I hired, who you have been told, who there are notes in my record, is the person you should call about this, but she doesn't want to talk to me because I know what I'm talking about and the end user doesn't. She still has not lifted MFA. She still keeps claiming she does, and she calls once per day to say the MFA should be lifted. Can you please log in? So I finally asked her, look, you need to cut out all the polite nonsense and just tell me what it is that you want me to answer. And to her credit, she complied. Unfortunately, what that resulted in was her asking me if I had restored the Microsoft Authenticator app on the physically destroyed device. What the hell does that mean? I don't know, and she wasn't able to explain. At this point, my next step, which is on the docket for tomorrow, is to call Microsoft Accounts Receivable again and demand a different Convergys rep, because this one clearly is never going to get anything done. In the meantime, my client has now been, even since he contacted me and since we got the first call back from the opened ticket, it has still been more than 2 full weeks without access to his email.
Yeah, and there's a whole different problem about the way to get around 2FA involves talking to a support person who can be socially engineered.
Yes.
This is gaping security problem.
Exactly. This is not the first time I've dealt, with these MFA reset issues for Google or for Microsoft. I've dealt with it multiple times for both entities, and you never know whether you're going to get a rep who's just like, yep, okay, got it, disable MFA, and they don't really ask you anything, don't try to verify anything. They're just like, yep, I like the vibes I'm getting off this guy, I'm just going to go ahead and disable that MFA. Or, you get somebody who demands insane amounts of documentation, or, in the third case, my current issue with Ruthie, who I don't even know what the process is over there, clearly has no idea what she's doing and is never going to make any progress.
Part of the lesson of this, to protect yourself, is make sure you have more than one administrator account. That if an administrator gets locked out because of, like you said, a broken phone, that somebody else has access to get in there and disable MFA mutually. So, because having to depend on support, A, is a security problem to begin with, but B, can lead to 2 weeks of frustration and no resolution.
Yeah, I think another way to restate that is that you can't safely and effectively use these services, which are supposed to be, half the selling point is supposed to be anybody can use this. It's all been made very easy. You've got nice clicky GUIs and everything is set up and everything's running, and the best IT department in the world is supposedly managing your email. And yet the takeaway here is you can't safely use that system without a professional, high quality IT admin of your own staying on top of things. So this whole idea that, the real selling point behind the cloud is you no longer need IT, afraid not.
Yeah, and it really goes to show that if the MFA you're using doesn't have some backup codes and a bunch of other things to make sure you're able to get in if you lose or destroy your phone, you probably need to look at other options.
Which is, again, part of what I was saying with the professional, IT admin part. I've talked about this issue online. I've done some ranting, on Mastodon.
What? You really?
Yeah. Believe it or not. One of the common responses I get, which irritates the crap out of me because it misses the point so badly, is people want to point out, oh, well, you could have saved scratch codes. Authenticator lets you do that, or you could have done this, or you could have done that, or you could have done the other thing proactively and, made sure you were on top of things. And it's like, yeah, I get that. And if I had been the one who was originally responsible for this account, I absolutely would have. I don't need any support from Microsoft for anything and don't want any. But that's not what this service is or is supposed to be. It's supposed to be the easy thing to use where all your bases are covered and everything makes sense, and it isn't.
Yeah, and if that's what you're supposed to do, Microsoft should be taking more steps to remind people of that. Like, one of the nice things that the Signal app does is occasionally, for no reason, it will just ask you for your PIN to make sure you remember your PIN while you're still logged in. And it feels like your MFA app should be like, test your backup system. Whether that's, I have a second phone that also has this MFA app, or I'm going to fall back to SMS messages or something that, every nth time you MFA, it should prompt you to test one of the backup mechanisms and make sure they all still work. Because having a backup mechanism that you set up 2 years ago and I lost the scratch codes, or, I had it on a second device, but I stopped using that phone for so long and the battery gave out and I don't have it anymore, or whatever. Like all backups, you should test them regularly. And because these systems are targeted at not IT professionals, the app needs to handle a lot of the user experience of that testing in a better way so that it happens for people that aren't of our mindset.
And even that wouldn't have helped here, because this particular user wasn't getting hit with MFA daily because they had Outlook set up on their desktop PC, and Outlook was set up not to require MFA on their desktop PC, and Microsoft allows that. But you can't set up the account on a new device without MFA, and you can't log into the web without MFA, neither of which he did on a normal day-to-day basis. The folks that want to rant at somebody for being dumb, they could rant at my client for not having had proper IT support, the whole time. I think that's a little unkind and unfair to, lay on a one-person shop, but you could at least state that. And also, if the service is supposed to require a solid professional IT admin on the other end, on the customer side, to interface with the people on the Microsoft side of it, then why am I talking to some idiot asking me things like, have you restored MFA on the broken phone yet? And who, I also should mention, she wanted to remote control my workstation because she didn't believe I knew what the MFA prompt looked like. Again, just none of this lines up. None of this makes coherent sense. No matter how you parse it, once you're done with it, at the end of the day, what you're left with is Microsoft has set up a completely bullshit system that doesn't work, hasn't been thought through, and they just don't care. As long as they can keep busily trying to firewall themselves off from their own customers because they see them as inconvenient as anything but a paycheck, this is going to continue happening. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. You can no longer get hold of a human at all when you call tech support. You're discouraged from calling tech support at all. Everything is robotic. Even these stupid MVPs on their forums are just boilerplating stuff, and they don't care how many thousands of times they've been told in identical threads by different people, hundreds of people per thread, that their, quote, solution doesn't work. They just keep pasting it because that's what gets them to be an MVP in the first place.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Automox. If you're evaluating endpoint management solutions, the real risk isn't which tool you choose, it's choosing one without a proven blueprint for success. Because while most endpoint tools promise automation, next to none promise outcomes. That's why Automox introduced Turnkey results. Turnkey removes the uncertainty that holds endpoint automation back. It delivers a personalized results blueprint, so Automox is configured and operated to achieve real outcomes from day one. No trial and error, just clarity. Each blueprint is validated across millions of endpoints managed by Automox and tailored to your specific environment, your risk tolerance, and your operational goals. Instead of guessing how aggressive to be with automation or how to configure policies safely, start with a plan you can trust. And you can choose to implement the plan yourself or have Automox do it for you. Either way, you get faster time to value, lower risk, and predictable endpoint outcomes. Automox Turnkey results. Know the plan, trust the result. Learn more at www.automox.com. Vehicle tire pressure sensors enable silent tracking.
This is not a real high-tech thing, and it should be fairly obvious if you know how tire pressure monitors actually work. They are wireless, and they broadcast in the clear. The thing that I hadn't been aware of is apparently in my own country, that standard is mandated. All passenger vehicles must have tire pressure monitors, and they must communicate wirelessly and in the clear. What that means is if you happen to be in control of devices that are near enough to a roadway to intercept the tire pressure sensors as vehicles go by, since one of the things those tire pressure sensors has to transmit is a GUID that informs the vehicle's computer, hey, I am one of these tires that belongs to you, you know what I am, because of course you wouldn't want your vehicle displaying some other car's tire pressure data, right? Well, that means all of your devices are uniquely identifiable by these tire pressure sensor signals that they're broadcasting all the time. So if you can intercept those signals, you can track where cars go. This is essentially the same kind of vulnerability as you have, with cell phones that have their Wi-Fi turned on. And so you can see the MAC address of the Wi-Fi, which manufacturers largely responded to by randomizing MAC addresses when you're not connected to a specific network. But then also, if you've got Bluetooth on, your device might be identified that way. In short, when you're walking around with a gigantic, noisy electronic suite in your pocket or in your vehicle, things that can pick up electronic noise are going to know where you are.
Yeah, like if you've been concerned about these automated license plate readers everywhere, well, it turns out the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth built into your car's entertainment system and the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth built into your phone are also things that are just invisible license plates, uniquely identifying you, kind of wandering around with you. And collecting this information could help find correlations between those things. We see these four tires always go together. That's pretty normal. But they're also talking about by looking at the output of these sensors, they can maybe tell whether you have an extra person in the car compared to yesterday when you drove by the same corner on the way to work and things like that. And they're really looking at how they could correlate and they picked out 12 specific cars and tried to track them as much as they could to figure out, what they were doing and what was going on and how much information they could gather just from these kind of stray emissions.
And you don't need a lot of expensive equipment for this. The devices they were using were about $100, and they could pick up these signals from 40 or 50 meters away. I don't know what that is in your units, Jim, but it's a pretty long way.
Come on. You don't know that a meter is roughly a yard and a yard's 3 feet? It's about 120 to 150 feet.
Well, there you go then.
Which does seem a kind of longish range for your tire pressure sensor.
Yeah, given that really they just need to communicate within the car, you'd think it would be...
Well, I'm guessing part of it is the signal has to be able to get through the engine and the body of the car, and it just happens in enough amplitude to do that means it also goes a lot farther outside of the car.
And it needs to be reliable. And in addition to the interference, there also is going to be a lot of competition in the electronic space because cars are very noisy. Even before you get into the other electronics, if we're talking about a traditional, gas combustion vehicle rather than a battery electronic vehicle, you are putting out a ton of noise every time your spark plugs fire. And your spark plug wires, those are antennas.
And at some point, your rear tires may be further from the car's computer than the rear tires of the car in front of you. And the back tires have to yell louder to make sure you hear them over the tires from the other car.
Yeah.
Anytime you're beside somebody at a red light, guaranteed a couple of their tires are going to be closer than a couple of yours.
Yep. So yeah, it's not really something you turn down. But to what Jim was saying with the regulations in the US that came in 2007 or so, you basically can't disable the tire pressure sensors without compromising the safety functionality of the car, which means you can't just easily turn this off.
The extra irony to me being how frequently, in my experience, those tire pressure monitoring systems are wildly broken. When you go to get your tires changed, the odds are better than even that they will not bother properly identifying which sensor is on which wheel. And when you get back in your car, if you develop low pressure in one tire a few months later, you go confidently to put air in that tire and you discover, no, I have to check all 4 tires because my car told me it was the right rear. But it turns out it's actually, the front left or whatever, because again, the tire people, they didn't care. They just put whichever wheel on whichever, and they didn't bother resetting anything up in the computer. So half of the value the system is supposed to bring to you in the first place, it's usually not there.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Chad writes, I have a laptop with 2 disks, disk A and disk B. The disks are running a ZFS mirror. I recently discovered that I have a bad stick of RAM. I'm afraid to use the laptop until I get new RAM. I have a second laptop with good RAM. Can I remove just disk A from my first laptop and install it in the second, use it for a few weeks, then move it back to the first laptop once it is repaired? Will ZFS do the right thing and update disk B for the writes it missed?
The short answer is yes. So on each of the disks, ZFS keeps track of what Uber blocks and what transactions that disk has seen. And so when you import the pool on the second laptop, it'll say, okay, one of the disks is missing, but I have all the data, so I'm okay. And it will let you use the disk and write to it and have fun. And then when you move disk A back into the first laptop and you go to import the pool, it'll be like, okay, I see disk A is much newer than disk B, and I know that they're a mirror. And then it'll be, okay, I see disk B is, 2 weeks behind. And so it will replay the transactions to catch disk B up. Or if it's 2 behind to be sure, it'll just do a resilver. But either way, shortly after you get it up and running, it'll have finished the scrub and will tell you, disk A and B are now back to being identical and everything's good to go.
Now, the caveat here is, do not use the other disk while you've got the one disk moved to the other laptop and you're booting it up and using it there. I don't know if the first laptop, boots at all, whatever, but if you're actively using both laptops, ZFS is not going to be able to figure that out reliably. You're going to need to do some real management and figure out which stuff you want to keep and which you want to throw away, and you're going to need to measure twice, cut once on that. But if you leave the first laptop completely shut down the whole time that you're using one drive out of the pool in the second laptop, then yes, everything will just work and you won't have to worry about it.
Yeah, if you want an extra bit of safety, if you can create a checkpoint on them, but I think you're better off not booting up the old laptop until you get the RAM fixed anyway. And so yeah, just don't power up the first laptop until you bring the disk back, and you'll be completely fine.
This actually reminds me of a problem I ran into recently. I've got a USB disk. It's an NVMe drive in an enclosure.
Well, there's your problem.
Yes, indeed. Anyway, no, the problem is that I didn't send any snapshots to it for several months, like a lot of months. It just sat there, just doing nothing in a drawer. I pulled it out and tried to sync my NAS back to it, but there were no snapshots in common because Sanode had pruned the old snapshots. So is my only option here to just start again? Or is there a way that I can somehow send a snapshot to it that is in the middle?
Nope. You're going to have to start over with a full replication. If you don't have a snapshot or a bookmark in common, then yeah, a full replication is the only way to begin again.
Right. I can't send that intermediate snapshot then. It's just not having it.
The way ZFS incremental replication works is it sends every block modified from the starting snapshot to the ending snapshot. If you don't have a starting snapshot, it doesn't know what blocks to send.
Now, what you could do is hop into your handy time machine, time travel back a few months, take a bookmark of your most recent common snapshot before, it all goes stale. Then, even though Sanoid prunes the actual snapshot on your source machine, you still have the bookmark. All you need on the source side is a bookmark. You don't have to have the actual snapshot. Bookmarks, unlike snapshots, take no space, even if they diverge wildly from everything around them, because they don't actually contain the blocks themselves. It's basically just like letting you know, okay, that snapshot that we bookmarked, this was the very last TXG on that snapshot. So if you want to do an incremental based on this, you want to send everything newer than this TXG. And that's all it really is. So you can keep those around forever. If you had taken a bookmark of that snapshot before it got pruned, you would not have broken your replication chain and you'd still be able to pick up from where you left off.
Doesn't Syncoid make its own snapshot when it does replication that wouldn't get pruned until it's safe?
Not if you do no sync snap.
Well, why would you do no sync snap?
So you don't end up with a bunch of old snapshots that turn out to be useful later down the line.
Yeah. So by default, Syncoid does in fact create its own synchronization snapshot to avoid precisely this issue. It creates its own snapshot that it manages and only destroys old ones after a successful replication. The issue can be when you have more than one replication partner and you're running Syncoid with the default arguments on all of them, you wind up with foreign snapshots which will never be pruned and which get, massively ancient later. So that doesn't work real well. When you get in a more complicated environment with multiple replication partners, you generally do want to use no sync snap. But then you're left to actually intelligently manage common snapshots yourself, which puts us where we are now. And is why, again, I was telling Joe, your solution in the future, if you've got something that's going to be staying cold forever, but you don't want to break the replication chain, is make sure you bookmark your most recent common snapshot with that thing before it goes cold. Then you'll be good to go.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or your feedback. You can find me at joerest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.